He did know about this, and still it didn't come out. Has Simon Case got questions to answer?
It's he was separate from the process. I think that's a very interesting issue about should he have informed his colleague who actually chaired the panel,
Yeah,
and that's possibly one of the issues which should be examined,
yeah.
because I'm absolutely certain that his colleague who chaired the panel did not know.
Just to help us understand some of the context of this before we go on, the appointment of the BBC chair is made by the Prime Minister together with the Culture Secretary, but there is a role for the Commissioner for Public Appointments and an appointments panel. How does that work?
What happens is that the job is advertised on the internet. People can apply. Then there is a kind of sifting to produce a shortlist. There's a panel which interviews those shortlisted. The panel in that case was chaired by the Permanent Secretary at the Department of Culture, Media and Sport, Sarah Healy, who's been actually talking about it this afternoon to a Commons committee. And there's an independent, what they call senior independent panel member on it, who was a very distinguished man who sadly died last year, who'd been a public servant and involved in the Church of England and things. And he was to guarantee the probity of it. Because it was such a prominent appointment, I, as regulator, normally I got involved when there were complaints or after the process. But given this was so important, I was involved during it, and I talked to DCMS and I talked to the senior independent panel member, Sir William Fittle, during the process of it to make sure it was robust and independent. This was partly because before it was announced in the autumn of 2020, Number 10 had indicated to the Sunday Times that their preferred candidate was Charles Moore, who then withdrew, and then indicated Richard Sharp. At the same time, they indicated Paul Dacre was their favoured candidate for Ofcom chair. And I was very annoyed about this because it prejudiced the idea of having an open competition. And so I got assurances that there would be a proper competition. And on the whole, there was. And people knew that Richard Sharp had given money to the Tory party
Yeah.
and that he was close to Boris Johnson.
Right. Now, that said, then, Peter, should Richard Sharp's involvement in whatever role in Boris Johnson's loan from an Australian billionaire, should that have been considered? Should it have been on the table when he was being considered and appointed?
I think that that's why my successor, William Shawcross, is absolutely rightly reviewing the whole process, and I'm very happy to cooperate with him because quite a lot of the stuff I know, obviously, from my period. None of us knew about what has emerged in the last few days. I didn't know. The panel, I'm absolutely certain, and I checked on this, didn't know, and DCMS didn't know. So I think these were material facts. Now, Richard Sharp has said, look, all he did was put people in touch. He wasn't involved otherwise. He consulted the cabinet secretary who told him to back off while he was applying to be BBC chair. I think perception is really important in all these things. And yes, he should have said, look, I was involved at an early stage with an issue involving the Prime Minister, and here's what it is, but I'm no longer involved. And that actually would have acted as a reassurance that he recognised there was a potential conflict. Whether there was, which he denies, is a matter for the investigation to establish.
Mm.
But I think it would have been in everyone's interest that there'd been much greater transparency early on. I mean, I did a lot of due diligence, as it's called, issues, so that people, if they've got anything embarrassing in their background, it's always declared at an early stage
Mm.
of an interview, so everyone knows. It's not necessarily disqualification, but everyone should know. And I think it would have been in his interests and everyone's interests if these things had been known earlier.
Right, now, would you just set that out for me a little more clearly? You say that it should have been made known that Richard Sharp was involved in some way in this huge loan to Boris Johnson from a billionaire friend who was a relative, I think. Why should that have been known? Boris Johnson is saying today that Richard Sharp was appointed purely on merit, that he's a good and wise man. So why did it matter? Why does it matter?
Because it matters in terms of, are there any links between the person doing the appointing, which of course is Boris Johnson, and the candidate? And I think it's desirable, not that it should be disqualification, I emphasize that. I mean, it's very important, but that all the factors should be known. And that's why in interviews for public posts, there's always what I call the embarrassment question. At the end of an interview, people are asked, is there anything in your background which could potentially be an embarrassment? Now, that said, Boris Johnson is right. Richard Sharp was a very strong candidate. I mean, it was one of the things I said publicly at the time he was appointed, when I was reassured by what I knew then about the process, that he came out very strongly out of the interview. He was very well qualified for that, and that was the view of those involved in the process. So, he wasn't a marginal candidate; he was a very strong candidate.
Right.
That should be set aside. The other factors, like his long-term support for the Tory party, which is no disqualification.
Yes.
There is a debate about whether people in those positions should have political links, but the current position is not a disqualification.
Right. We don't know, and we can't know what the other panel would have said had they known about his role, Richard Sharp's role in this loan, because it didn't happen. And how can we answer that question? Is it possible that this might have borne on that decision? Is it possible this might have been the embarrassment question that was never asked and could have got in the way of the appointment?
It's impossible to tell that. I mean, it really is. I mean, you put it very well, John, that, it's the unanswerable question. I think candor would have helped, especially as we now know he did consult the cabinet secretary who told him back off, don't get involved at all. If he'd said that at the time, people would have said, okay, fair enough. But it's impossible to tell
Yeah.
on that. I mean, as I say, he had, from all I read and all I understood from talking to people involved in interviews, he was a very strong candidate. But obviously, it was a factor which should have been considered. Like lots of factors are considered and taken into account. Some act against people. Some saying, well, so what? So it's a difficult balance. But obviously, it opens a broader issue of the political links of those involved in prominent public positions, which at present are okay, but people may want to debate that.
Right. So it should have been examined just so the panel could weigh up whether it had any bearing on whether he should be appointed. We know, and you mentioned it there, a piece of the cabinet secretary, the head of the civil service, Simon Case, the government official closest and nearest to Boris Johnson and the most powerful man in Whitehall. He did know about this, and still it didn't come out. Has Simon Case got questions to answer?
He was separate from the process. I think that's a very interesting issue about should he have informed his colleague who actually chaired the panel,
Yeah.
and that's possibly one of the issues which should be examined.
Yeah.
Because I'm absolutely certain that his colleague who chaired the panel did not know.
Right. Well, you can give me your opinion. You're outside the process now. You may be contributing your thoughts, but should the cabinet secretary have told them what he knew?
I'm very reluctant to second guess that at present. I certainly think that um, I think probably he should have made it aware to the relevant his colleague who's chairing the panel. Yes.